Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our third podcast in the Five Talents That Really Matter series. Today, we have with us again the two authors of the Five Talents That Really Matter, Sarah Dalton and Barry Conchie. And we're going to be talking about what they've learned from their exhaustive research that actually became a good part of the book. And so, we're going to be talking about 58,000 assessments and what they learned from those assessments. And these assessments were done around the world, and people either did it because they were part of a process where they were a candidate for a job or they just wanted feedback. So, you're Barry and Sarah, and you're sitting there and you're like, we have 58,000 data points. What do we do with that? Well, we start looking for what the key messages are. And that's what we want to talk about today. They had gleaned 18 key messages from these 58,000 assessments. And let's start talking about those. So let me ask, of all of the things that you had learned, and by the way, you do a great job of condensing these in the book and telling us about them and getting people to really look at how they could how these things challenge perhaps their own assumptions. Tell me what was, the one or two or three things that surprised you.
I think as people read through that chapter, one of the things they should be cognizant of is these same trends will play out at different levels in their own organizations. One of the surprising findings for me was that in every organization, there's this list of high potential leaders, right? And there is no doubt that leadership potential can be predicted way earlier than people might often realize. So we get brought into companies to study these high potential people. And what we would expect is this group really is the best of the best. We'd expect that when we assess them on our leadership assessment, that they come out really strong, very talented, higher scoring leaders. But it's not what we find. When you look at the range of scores of that high potential group, it typically conforms to what you would call a normal curve. They are not as good, they're not as talented as those companies think. And so this gets us back to the issue of likability, where sometimes the people that we've worked with the longest, we feel the most positive about them. We want to do the right thing. We want to keep promoting them up into the company, but there are limits to what some people can achieve. And just because I perform really well in the role that I'm in right now doesn't always mean that I've got the potential for the next job. And that's exactly what we see when we assess these lists of leaders.
So basically, their high potentials were, probably some high potentials in that group, but essentially they were a normal distribution. And I
And
think
think
that's,
about this, Pamela, because
yeah.
you're absolutely right. How did they get nominated to this list? And typically what happens is either each division or each functional leader gets to nominate one, two, or three people from
Mhm.
their organizations. Now, when people talk about calibration
Mhm.
around leadership potential, that word lacks the precision that is intended in its use. And what you end up with is just a distribution of, they might be the best people from each part of the organization, but that doesn't add up to a meaningful prediction that these are the very best people overall. So that's the reason why we find this situation. But it is surprising when you see it played out in real life.
It is, especially when a lot of organizations go through these succession planning processes or talent review processes, and they have a nine box. And we know that the best place to be in a nine box is the upper right hand quadrant. Nobody wants to be in the lower left hand quadrant. And so you're right. They talk about who's high potential in my business, who's high potential in my group. And then they get populated in these boxes. And then at some point, you have to step back and say, are these people really high potential? And I think it's great that you took a look at that, because I think every organization has to look at that conversation that they're having about potential and how they're really going to measure that.
Well, when you talk about the 9 box, what about the people who don't make it into the top right quadrant, but who might be brilliant in the next role? And yet the talents that they have either aren't being surfaced where they are right now, or it's being suppressed by the people above them. Right. And that's some of the most rewarding work that we get to do, because when we assess high potential populations, or when we assess broader populations to figure out what talent is in the organization, we sometimes uncover people who've got the talent to be the next brilliant leader in that company. And yet they were never on anybody's list.
I love what you mentioned just a moment ago about they were suppressed. And I want to share with our audience, just as you had phrased it in the book. In every organization, we find outstanding leaders, often women and minorities, deeper in their structures, who are being held back, undermined, suppressed, and generally mismanaged by weaker, typically male leaders and executives. I haven't been in an organization where I haven't seen some expression of that play out.
I think in the example that we gave, I mean, it is surprising to see this, but I don't know whether you remember when McKinsey brought out the War for Talent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, this was essentially a treatise that said the companies that get the most talented people are the ones that are going to win in the future. That's essentially the thesis.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people got really excited then about talent, even though they couldn't really define it very well. Well, our thesis is a little bit different. The war for talent can actually be won inside your own organization if only you open your eyes. Now, it's not always the case that there are hidden gems in every company, but it's nearly always the case that people aren't that bothered looking for them, right? Now, you can look and not find, which is fine, but what we tend to find is that there are brilliant people hidden in organizations, and they tend to be suppressed. Now, we mentioned women and minorities as, the two groups that tend to suffer the most from this. I'm not going to go into projections as to the reasons why, because it would just be my own subjective perspective. But the data is pretty clear. Some leaders struggle with highly talented leaders on their teams, and they suppress them. They either get poor performance reviews, they don't get any oxygen or publicity through the organization. Nobody knows who they are. In the preface to the book, we tell the story of a company that we worked with during an acquisition, where we found this brilliant woman that was hidden under a male leader who was a shopping leader. He was just a very, very poor manager of people. And she called the experience of going through our assessment liberating with respect to her career, because she was promoted above this guy. He didn't last very long. He was cast aside during the merger acquisition. She was put into the leadership position. She was brilliant. CEO never heard of her. She was only 4 steps down from the CEO. CEO had never heard of her. Executive team had never had her on any list. Now, I'd like to think it was an exception, but it isn't an exception. Now, I've got to say, some companies are really good at spotting talent early on, and they do fast track people. They do take risks with people. We'd just like to see more companies doing it. So that was shocking to me, finding that out.
The other thing that, as I was going through the 18 things that you highlighted, one of the things that really stuck out to me had to do with leadership deficits. And you found that there's a significant leadership deficit in strategic thinking and growth orientation that is a product of poor initial selection decisions for first and second level managers. And the reason I think this is so important is, if you look at organizations today, what do they say? We want strategic thinking. We want a growth orientation. We want to grow the company. They all pick growth orientation as a competency if they're using a competency model. But yet you found that this is a deficit. Could you say more about that?
Well, we quoted a CEO in this section, lamenting the fact that as he looked at his top leadership levels, couldn't find the strategists. He had plenty of people who could roll their sleeves up and get stuff done, but no real strategic thinking partner who could help him craft the future direction of the company. This company, by the way, employs 280,000 people.
Wow.
So this is not an insignificant issue. And so he said, where are all the strategists? And I had a conversation. I said, well, I've got a thesis around this. Let's go looking for it. And my idea was that because action orientation is such an important attribute in top leadership level, indeed, it dominates in many companies, action orientation, it can become a problem. My idea was that maybe people who aren't action oriented aren't surviving very long at lower levels.
Yeah.
So we went deeper into the organization. We had a bunch of other assessments that we conducted, and we found out that these people were getting terminated lower down the organization.
Wow.
So they were good strategic thinkers, but that wasn't what was needed in those lower level roles. But just a few minutes ago, Sarah was talking about, the 9 box, and what about the people who aren't in the top right-hand side but occupy one of the other boxes? Why don't we ask different questions of them to see whether they would fit better somewhere else, and maybe occupy the upper right quadrant in a different role? Well, it's the same here. We see just an overwhelming selection bias for action orientation and a bias against questioners, provokers, pokers, prodders, the people who look at the world in odd ways that sometimes slow us down, make our brain hurt. I mean, think of all those meetings that these people have been in, where discussion has been going on, and some people have just been sat there either completely checked out or saying, for goodness sake, just choose one of the options and let's go, right?
Yeah.
So we understand the action orientation and the urge, but what's happening in organizations is that the real thinkers, the ones who aren't the first to show up when there's a crisis, because they're thinking of the reasons why we couldn't prevent it, and they're getting terminated. And that was the answer in this organization. It was about 5 or 6 levels below executive level, and these people weren't surviving.
I think one of the other important things for companies to just get right in their mind is that when you talk about strategic thinking capability or a growth orientation, we've got to recognize that these are not training and development opportunities. These are ways of thinking. They can be measured, they can be predicted in people. It's not just the case that we plug leaders into the role and put them through a training camp and expect that they're going to come out as brilliant strategists. That's never the case.
Yeah. I was curious on a number of themes that you uncovered in the research. I was curious about the themes that talked about the differences between men and women. And particularly the first one where it talked about the assessment scores of women versus men. And being a woman myself, when I read that, I was like, well, of course. And it was that scores of women executive leadership positions scored considerably higher than those of their male peers. Say more about that, and then in general talk about the gender differences you found in the research.
So just really quickly, and Barry, I know you'll want to chime in on this. We've amassed this database of over 58,000 global executive leaders, and we track demographics on all of those candidates. So we know their race, we know their gender, and when we compare groups in terms of assessment scores, we see that the overall scores for groups are almost statistically insignificant, particularly when we're just comparing men and women.
Okay.
So average overall assessment score for men in our database is about 37.7 mean score. For women, 37.6. Statistically insignificant, almost dead even when you compare those groups. But the difference is in who gets selected. right? So when you look at the appointed male executives in top leadership roles, average overall score is about 42.
Mm-hmm.
For female executives appointed to top leadership roles, average overall score of that group is 45. Now, the difference in our world between a 42% and a 45 is actually pretty significant.
Uh-huh.
So what we find is that female leaders who get these top jobs have to be measurably stronger to even be considered. And then why is that?
I think
Why is that? Well, that's a good question. Why is that?
I would add to that there is a perceptual bar that is applied to candidates that is unequal and uneven. And, fewer women get to executive level positions than we think should be the case. Because of factors that are being considered that are less to do with their talent and more to do with things like career gaps.
Mm-hmm.
Where we see a lot of bias that affects women who can't explain why they took 7 years out of work or 3 years out of work when they were going through childbirth and early years of child rearing. But the issue for us when we look at our assessment is, we have here a phenomenally fair and valid assessment when you think of it in terms of adverse impact. I mean, the scores between men and women, as Sarah said, are statistically identical, but the appointment rate for women, we appoint fewer women and they have to have higher scores. So the other issue in this, which might be of interest to listeners, is this: the range of scores that apply to men who are appointed to leadership positions is far broader than the range of scores for women. So not only do women have to have a higher score, but the range of scores for women getting appointed is a lot narrower. And what that tells you is, in our view, if you want to put it kindly, way more incompetent men are getting through the net than incompetent women. And that's a price that companies pay without realizing it. And that comes back to the question: you'd be better off knowing this information before you make these appointments and understanding this data than blindly going ahead, because, we don't think these trends are changing pretty soon.
Exactly. One of the things that both of you talked about in our last podcast, where we're talking about selection, was likability. You go through an interview process and you can really see it start to happen, that people start building a relationship and then they come out of there going, I really like this person. We had to hire them. I really like them. But when we looked at the 18 insights that are in the book, likability, and you talked about too many leaders find it hard not to fall in love. I love that. That a lot of times you choose the person that you like, and they may have a lower assessment score than someone that would be more capable in this role, but you don't like as much as this individual. And so it seems like we fall into the likability trap yet again.
This is a funny one for me, because there's definitely a place in organizations for leaders who've got a ton of relational sophistication.
Yes.
In terms of how they invest and develop their people, the way that they position and pick people, the kind of accountability that they show. One of the areas that we measure in this assessment is around relational sophistication. How good are you at building a broad network around yourself and developing the people underneath you? So there's definitely value in that. But if that's all we're paying attention to, I think we are ignoring a range of other characteristics that are actually really important, that themselves add up to a broader picture of leadership effectiveness. So if we're just falling into the likability trap, I think we might be missing other things.
There is a related point that I want to build on here, and I want to open up, maybe 3 or 4 of these other findings of the 8.
Certainly.
As I develop this point. One of the findings that we had was that lower scoring leaders were more likely to terminate people who challenged them.
Wow.
Now, you know, we often look at issues of disagreement and dissent within organizations, and lower scoring leaders struggle with the idea of dissent. But here's the interesting thing. When you ask them, do you encourage disagreement, debate, and dissent? Everybody says yes.
Yeah, for sure.
It does. But what we found was that low-scoring leaders were more likely to retaliate against people who expressed a strong point of view if it differed from the leader's point of view. And, you know, the issue, therefore, for us opened the door to looking at all of the other characteristics around lower scoring leaders. So, for example, lower scoring leaders take significantly longer to terminate poor performing team members, and they often never do terminate them than we see with higher performing leaders. So if you've got moderate leaders in your organization, it's likely that you've got survivability bias amongst your employees because nobody's leaving. Now that might be misrepresented in some HR organizations as we've got fantastic turnover rates. We would look at that situation and say, your turnover rates need to get way worse before they get better. And you need to clear out a lot of dead wood in the organization. So, you know, in those circumstances, low performing leaders are a disaster. By contrast, we found that higher scoring leaders are more likely to take longer to fill vacancies than lower scoring leaders. Then you might think, well, that sounds bad. Now, it's what Sarah was referring to before. You got to hold out for the best candidate. And a lower scoring leader is less talent focused than a high scoring leader, so they fill vacancies quicker. In fact, they often refer to the speed with which they fill vacancies as an asset, supporting why they believe they themselves are stronger leaders. And it's really quite staggering to me. You look at data like that and you think, oh my goodness, not only might we be measuring the wrong things in the organization and exacerbating the findings that we're talking about here, but we might be building an organization with more moderate leaders than we could ever really afford to live with. And, you know, the consequences are disastrous. So I just wanted to add those 2 points to that.
No, I think that's a great point. How many times have we seen goals or KPIs for recruiting that are about days to fill? Not about the quality of the candidate, not about fit, but they're about days to fill. And you see that as well. You see that some leaders are compensated and have goals around how long it takes for them to fill an opening. And it could have nothing to do with that the ability of that person to perform and lift the performance of the organization. It's just that we filled it in 30 days. Clap, clap, clap.
This is where we're trying to get more sophisticated in how we partner with some of our clients, because if we get them really good data, and we can do this recruiter by recruiter around how talented their candidates are, how talented the candidates are that are ultimately being selected into the company, then we can help HR people have really good conversations with the business around the quality of the hires that we're bringing in. So it all goes back to, do you have good data coming in and how are you using it?
Exactly. You know, one of the pieces of data that I'd like to put on a billboard somewhere, and just have it flashing as executives pass, is that talented high scoring leaders are 5.6 times more likely than less talented leaders to promote a talented younger employee across multiple levels, skip level promotions. And so many organizations say, when we recognize great talent, we promote quickly, we do skip level promotions. I don't know if as many organizations do that as say that they do that, but the difference it can make in the performance of the company is significant. It's material, I believe, if you're talking about something that's 5 times more impactful than other decisions that you make.
So think of a series of connected themes here, Pamela, which are really rotating around the variance we see between more talented leaders and less talented leaders. I mean, I mentioned dissent and disagreement and how you handle that. And lower scoring leaders don't handle it well. They tend to retaliate. Higher scoring leaders tend to encourage it. This particular issue on skip level promotions is predicated on a question that is very difficult for people to answer, or some people it's very difficult to answer. And that question is, how do you feel when someone who reports to you gets promoted above you? How do you feel? Not does it happen, not do you encourage it, not do you think it's a good thing? How do you feel about it? And what we find, and it's a massive difference, is that low scoring leaders hate it.
Yeah.
Because they think they're next in line. They don't think of their performance. They don't think of their talent. They think of their entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
And if they stick around and you've got a newcomer in your team and they're hitting it out the park,
Mm-hmm.
everybody else notices and thinks that person needs to be your boss or boss somewhere else. They find that a personal threat. And it's a relatively small percentage of leaders who lean into that situation and love it. I worked with one of our clients, this particular person and a client, for 25 years, one of the best leaders of people I've ever seen. And I asked him this question. He said, I can't wait till they're my boss. They're way better than I am.
Mm-hmm.
He said, my job's to make sure he doesn't screw up and make mistakes and prevent himself getting there or her, but my job's to get that person promoted. Now, the interesting thing is that leader was known as a promoter of talent in his organization. And I would sit down with leaders in that business and we would call out the names of people that were now in senior positions that once were on his team.
Mm-hmm.
There was about a dozen of them, and
Wow.
they were phenomenal people. That's the exception, and we need to turn it into a rule. But we don't find that. That's what the data shows. It's a major, major problem.
Well, I think the challenge is you need a secure person to say, I want to help this person succeed. I want them, they could be CEO someday, and maybe I can't. I've seen it a number of times where people say they want to, grow talent, but they want to grow them up to the point that they don't succeed beyond them. And I've seen that. And to your point, you miss out on a lot of great talent if you're not willing to skip level promote someone, if you're not willing to highlight them, if you're not willing to give them opportunities.
This gets us back to the issue, though, the need for leaders to hire people who are stronger than they are.
Yes.
Because if you're consistently hiring weaker members of your team, those people are never going to be credible candidates for other jobs in the company. And what leaders, I think, fail to realize is that they're limiting themselves in the process. Because if you've built a weak team who is entirely dependent on you as the leader, you also aren't going anywhere. Right?
Yeah, but here's the odd thing about that. Some leaders are perfectly fine with, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are they. It's a status quo sort of thing. I mean, it's kind of like, the world runs down the middle,
So
like
Pamela, on that very issue, let me paint a visual in everyone's mind that I don't ever want you to forget.
Oh, sure. Oh, yes, tell me.
Imagine you're looking at an organizational chart, let's say the top 5 levels of your company,
Mhm.
and each person is colored green, yellow, or red.
Yes.
Now, let me just explain. What we find consistently is that those colors collect vertically.
Yes.
So if you look at your executive team, Mrs. CEO, and you've got 8 direct reports and 3 of them are red, there is a massive chance that those red lines vertically will be populated by other red dots.
Yeah.
That's the visual you got to hold in your mind. The problem that nearly every CEO has right now is that they are completely clueless about how to populate that chart.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the 5 talents that really matter help, because the assessment we build creates that visual in a very, very effective way. And then to your point that people are comfortable, they aren't very good and I'm okay, we'll just survive.
Yeah.
Well, we get a nice helpful treatment of bleach to cleanse all that out and replace it with green. And I know I sound a little bit harsh when I say that, but companies are in business to succeed and make money. We can't tolerate huge red sections of organizations, but we find it.
That comes down to also one of the insights that you had from the research, which is while managers and leaders will say that I don't hire people like myself, I look for people that are different, that think differently. Your research showed that they exactly hire people like themselves. They look for their own characteristics in people that they're hiring. And that's how you get, basically it's how you get pools of mediocrity in many organizations.
It is. I mean, it's a point we made earlier in a previous podcast, but we do pick people like ourselves. We find that a refreshing reflection on ourselves. We feel good about ourselves when we do that. And we have to encourage people to look at the characteristics, traits, and dispositions of people on their team and get serious about really looking for candidates who are different. Because right now, everybody's playing a game and they're giving themselves a trophy for winning.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's winning this game.
I think where this book is going to help is in clarifying a definition of what the best leaders really do and the different kinds of talents that help people be successful. Because right now, Pamela, to the point you just made, leaders in making hiring decisions, we place a preference on the characteristics we know and like in ourselves, because experience has told us that these things help us be more successful in our role. So when we look for and see it in other people, then that guides the decisions that we make. I think if we can broaden people's definition of what talents actually predict leadership performance, and we can give better tools and methods of identifying those in people, hopefully we start to reverse some of these trends and start getting more people into jobs that just look and think differently than what we previously thought or placed a preference on.
Exactly. And with that, I do want to, we talked about the talents people need to pay attention to. And I just want to list for our audience the 5 talents that really matter: setting direction, harnessing energy, exerting pressure, increasing connectivity, and controlling traffic. In the next 2 podcasts, you're going to hear a deep dive on all of those talents and how you look at them from the perspective of your organization. But before we leave you today, Barry and Sarah, what advice do you have for organizations? What do leaders need to pay attention to make sure that some of these things that you learned, the pieces of research that can sometimes be a stumbling block, how do they make sure they don't fall into those issues?
Well, the The issue I want people to hold in their minds is that there is a significant gulf in the effects of having higher scoring leaders in your organization compared to lower scoring leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So I want you to start there. And my advice to organizations is to, have very good answers to the question about who our best people really are.
Yes.
And if I was to give advice to an individual leader, it would be that I want them to become obsessed with appointing people to their team who are demonstrably better than they are. Obsessed, not mildly interested, not, well, I'll kind of look at it once in a while, or maybe, well, I've got 3 vacancies coming up as these next group of mediocre people retire, I might look at it then. I want you to be obsessed about it, because good things happen when we get higher scoring leaders into organizations. And if you don't obsess about it, you won't do it.
That's true. So everyone listening, be obsessed with finding great talent, finding talent that's better than you are. And a way that you can learn more about that is by pre-ordering the book that's available on Amazon, The 5 Talents That Really Matter. It comes into the market on August 27th. And we'll be talking more about the 5 talents that really matter. And we'll also be talking about, in our last podcast, we'll be talking about DEI and the learnings from their research on DEI. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us again soon.